Today we're gathered to celebrate the life of Dr. Ernest J. Gaines, who is an acclaimed, internationally acclaimed Southern writer and has greatly shaped the way the world sees rural Blackness in South Louisiana. I am so happy to be able to present his friends and colleagues who worked with him directly. I am so happy and honored to have his family in attendance today as we celebrate his life about a year out from his passing. Today we're going to, after all the speakers, the audience will have an opportunity to share stories and memories. I'm going to introduce each speaker before they speak, and I ask all questions be reserved to the end. Give me a moment, I'm sorry. I'm just so grateful that we have some of his friends on today, and thank you all for being here. Our first speaker is Dr. Keith Clark, who is a professor and Gaines Scholar from George Mason University. He's written his newest book, The Navigations of the Fictions of Ernest J. Gaines, is currently out, and I have had the honor of working with him on so many different projects. So I do thank you for being on this talk with us to share your memories of your friend and your colleague. Everyone, Dr. Keith Clark.
Thank you, Shaylin, and hello, everyone, my fellow Gaines scholars, and hello to Mr. Gaines's friends and family, and thank you, Shaylin, for that warm introduction. Shaylin is a real jewel. I won't, bore you to death with all of the trouble I had getting online on the video today. We started working on it this morning, and it just was, it wasn't working, but Shaylin said, I will not be defeated. And so, alas, here I am. So thank you very much. I also have just finished celebrating my mom's 80th birthday. We actually are still doing it, so I had to get to a quiet place. She has an 8 and a 6-year-old, so it's pretty wild around here. But anyway, so thank you again, Shaylin. I truly regretted missing last fall's in-person PC, that's pre-COVID, not politically correct, memorial service held last fall. But between Mr. Gaines's passing and the death of a beloved mentor from graduate school at Chapel Hill just a few weeks before, I was emotionally running on fumes. So I appreciate the second chance that Miss Diane's gracious invitation has afforded me to offer my respects and a few words of gratitude. Her invitation truly sparked me to take an inventory of my encounters with Mr. G, which in retrospect really were not that many. Our first encounter was an interview that my LSU editor arranged to take place at the Gaines's residence in Oscar in 2013. My maiden voyage to his little postage stamp of Point Coupee was a little nerve-inducing. The voice of my now antiquated plug-in the cigarette lighter GPS directed me from the Baton Rouge airport to a street that dead ended at a big body of water where a ferry was supposed to shepherd me to new roads. But a police officer parked at the river's edge informed me that the ferry hadn't operated in years. Then, on the morning of the interview, things continued in this rather perilous vein. That same rusty and less than trusty GPS repeatedly insisted recalculating, that telling me that the Gaines's home was actually a mile before what I eventually discovered was their actual residence. And when I pulled up to the gate and informed Mrs. Gaines via the intercom that I was there for my 11 o'clock appointment with her husband, she responded less than enthusiastically, informing me that she'd never heard of me and didn't know about this so-called interview. But the subsequent conviviality of this initial encounter paved the way for a second encounter, as I found myself shocked and delighted, if also a tad bit apprehensive, when the Gaineses requested that I interview Mr. G at the 2014 Louisiana Book Festival, a visit which, unlike my first, didn't include GPS drama or a lizard tormenting me in the shower of my New Roads motel room. Once I recounted this interview to my GMU colleague who directed our annual Fall for the Book Festival, his eyes sparkled as he revealed to me that he'd been trying to get Mr. Gaines to come to Fairfax for years. So of course, he entreated me to ask Mr. Gaines if he would consent to me interviewing him yet again as part of our book festival. When I nervously called Mrs. G about this possibility, complicated by the fact that the green we were offering was less than long and that Mr. G no longer flew, she sensed how important this was to me and took it upon herself to convince him to take to the friendly skies and accept our invitation. Quite frankly, the interview wasn't the home run that I had envisioned. No fault of the interviewer or the interviewee, but the festival's decision to hold the event in the university sports and concert arena, about 10,000 capacity, and this made for an acoustic nightmare. But Mr. G shined nevertheless, and the most heartwarming part of the evening was watching him sign the books of hundreds of college and high school students in attendance, not to mention that he patiently indulged all of them who wanted to pose for countless selfies with him. And he did this just with no complaint. Of course, we went out and had a big drink afterwards. His visit to Fairfax was personally momentous for me for another reason. A colleague who was teaching one of Dr. Gaines's stories asked me if I'd ever looked at his Wikipedia page. I thought it an odd question. Of course, I had looked at his Wikipedia page many times. But my colleague pointed out something that I had totally overlooked. The picture of a beaming Mr. G was accompanied by the caption, Ernest Gaines at the Fall for the Book Festival. In addition, however, my colleague noted how the picture also bestowed upon me a modicum of fame, since my long legs, though thankfully not my face, were captured in the photo. So Mr. G was responsible for my moment of wiki notoriety. These gratifying personal encounters are now priceless, but the invitation to speak here tonight, this evening, challenged me to think of deeper points of intersection and commonality. I was born in Norfolk, Virginia, exactly 30 years after Mr. Gaines, in the same summer that MLK delivered his iconic I Have a Dream speech. So another suturing bond is place, which is only fitting given that the physical terrain of Point Coupee was the genesis of his boundless artistic imagination, and the southern part of my native state kindled my own literary interests, if not creative imagination. Though Virginia and Louisiana are very distinct southern states, we're both native sons of a region whose dust, whose history is embedded in our sinews, though the people in these places haven't always loved or even tolerated sons and daughters like us. But just as what he lovingly labeled the Louisiana thing that drives him, a phrase from one of his signature interviews, my Tidewater roots are indelible and irrepressible. You can probably hear them in my voice and cadence. I recall when I arrived to college in 1981, meeting someone from Maryland who remarked on my Southern accent. Like too many who hail from our region, I was conditioned to absorb these words as arrows, only realizing years later that, alas, how else was I supposed to sound? So when I first engaged Ernest Gaines's writing as a graduate student at the University of Kentucky, specifically his short story, The Sky is Gray, in the venerable Barksdale and Kinnaman 1972 anthology, Black Writers of America, did I finally see in 8-year-old James's introduction to the people and places of Bayonne traces of my own Southern boyhood and maturation, and how James's trek dramatized the arduous but necessary journey I needed to take to understand the inseparability of place, identity, community, and self. Still, in addition to our handful of personal encounters and, of course, the tremendous body of work which contains a callaloo of voices, stories, and lessons for me as a young Southern man and wannabe teacher/writer, I came to know Mr. Gaines most intimately in a rather intriguing way. Through printed versions of his interviews, so fitting that published interviews privilege both the spoken and the written, two forms which Ernest Gaines's work so deftly and seamlessly meld. I owe a great debt of gratitude to two of my fellow Gaines scholars and devotees, John Lowe and Marcia Gaudet, both of whom performed the Herculean task of collecting Mr. Gaines's copious interviews into 2 volumes, which probably took dozens of hours off of my own research time. Those interviews cast a brighter light on Mr. Gaines's inner life, his writing life to be sure, but importantly for me, his sense of how he came to be how he came to value what he did, his ethics, his guiding principles, and the people who shaped him both personally and artistically. I recall Mr. G's heartfelt reflection on the aunt who reared him for the first 15 years of his life, Miss Augustine Jefferson. When a television interviewer asked him, what was the one thing as a child that most influenced you as a writer? He notes that, for a few seconds, I couldn't think of anything else but my aunt. She had the greatest impact on my life, not only as a writer, but as a man. This pronouncement speaks so profoundly to my own Southern heritage, the inestimable influence of my mother and my aunts who molded such core dimensions of my identity, such as my decision to become a teacher and my grounding in spiritual values. His recognition of his stepfather's impact provided yet another connecting link. Ernest Gaines described Ralph Kohler as strong and very strict, and Mr. G expounded upon his lasting influence in a 1978 interview where he reflected on his migration from Louisiana to Cali. He said, when he got to California, he said, there were no libraries in Louisiana. I did not go to the public library until I went to California when I was 15, and I started going to the public library when I was about 16. The reason I went was because my stepfather told me to get off the block because I could get myself into trouble. And so I went to the library and started reading books. So I started reading and I started reading. I started reading a lot. This anecdote resonated with me on so many levels. It demonstrated how so many Black boys are steered toward physical pursuits, which usually eclipse more scholarly ones. For instance, in my interview for the book, Mr. Gaines recalled that as a teenager, he first chose the YMCA over the library, and how his first and only attempt at boxing resulted in a quick beatdown. And these physical endeavors usually eclipse more scholastic, so-called egg-headed ones. So this story reinforced for me how the library could become an invigorating space, a hallowed and a potentially empowering space, one that Black Southern boys aren't always encouraged to enter in a country where intellectual pursuits generally, and those by Black men specifically, are often discouraged and even ridiculed. This from 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 10 through 12. And in fact, you do love all of God's family throughout Macedonia. Yet we urge you, brothers and sisters, to do so more and more, and to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. Another dimension of Elder Gaines's life that I've respected and emulated is his relentless, even radical insistence on following his own creative compass, configuring his own roadmap, and charting his career path and life path. During the volcanic 1960s, when scores of young Black writers were wielding their pens as clenched fists, Mr. Gaines recalled being asked what he was doing to contribute to the struggle, and he replied in this way. I was writing the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman then, and most people thought I should be writing something about something more contemporary. But I stuck to my ground, to writing my particular book. I felt I had already set the goals of my writing, and I intended to go on. So I venerate and honor his willingness to eschew what's popular and trendy, to stand his creative ground, as he understood writing's power to effect change, not just for a moment, but its ineradicable power to endure long after slogans and catchphrases have served their usefulness. His commitment to a quiet but not cloistered life of creativity echoes what literary scholar Kevin Quashie describes in his book, The Sovereignty of Quiet, Beyond Resistance in Black Culture, as the sanctity and power of the quiet life. Professor Quashie states, in humanity, quiet is inevitable, essential. It is already there if one is looking to understand it. An aesthetic of quiet is not incompatible with Black culture. Elder Gaines's commitment to such a life modeled for me the radical power of solitude and writing, the quiet life as ennobling. He indeed envisioned and crafted his own commitment to living, in the words of Langston Hughes, without fear or shame. And I count myself as immeasurably blessed to now be able to count his devoted Miss Diane as my friend and someone whose strength, intelligence, resilience, and compassion, it truly inspires me. So Ernest J. Gaines, who personally over the course of 6 short but impactful years together with me, and creatively since the mid-1980s, is a man I honor as ancestor, artist, griot, and teacher. But I also celebrate and claim him as a fellow traveler and kindred spirit who, like me, had a passion for bookstores, sports, and good bourbon. He was and remains a beacon of Black Southern manhood and humanhood. His work and life model for me that Black rural Southern lives matter, that words matter, and word work matters. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Our next speaker, Dr. Gaudet, Professor Emerita, former and founding Ernest J. Gaines Center Director and Gaines Scholar and longtime friend and colleague of Dr. Ernest J. Gaines will now speak. Dr. Gaudet.
Thank you, Shaylin. On this last Saturday of October, and this year, the eve of All Saints' Day, my memories of Ernest Gaines draw me to the cemetery on River Lake Plantation. For over 20 years, Ernest Gaines and his wife Diane have hosted the Cemetery Beautification Day there. I especially remember him in later years, riding in the cemetery in the golf cart, usually with his grandson Nicholas at the wheel, talking and visiting with people, usually his brother Norbert, his sister Lois, nieces, nephews, people who came in from all over the country. And later he and Diane hosted a gathering at their home nearby with plenty of food and plenty of talk about the past, and also usually some gentleman jack. Last year, he hosted the annual Beautification Day at Mount Zion Cemetery 10 days before he passed away. Always a sports fan, he had watched Monday Night Football the night before. His brother Michael had been visiting from California that weekend, and he described the wonderful visit they had, sitting around the table, talking, laughing, and as always, telling stories. Gaines has said that he saw himself as a storyteller, someone who tried to put down on paper, quote, the sound of my people talking. Ernest Gaines has also said many times that his great obsession in life was to preserve this cemetery on River Lake Plantation, where his ancestors, including his beloved aunt, Augustine Jefferson, are buried. This is the cemetery in Oscar, Louisiana, where Gaines was born, the place where Gaines was born, and where he lived until he was 15 years old. Because of the efforts of Ernest and Diane Gaines, the cemetery has been preserved, unlike many plantation cemeteries in the South. The 16 heirs of River Lake Plantation deeded the acre of land where the cemetery is located to the nonprofit Mount Zion River Lake Cemetery Association in 1998. The Gaines's activism in preserving the cemetery where his ancestors, friends, and 2 brothers were buried resulted in this annual ritual of work and remembrance, the Mount Zion River Lake Beautification Day. Beginning in 1998, they've invited family, friends, students, and descendants of those who lived in Cherie quarters to come together on the last Saturday in October, the Saturday before La Toussaint, or All Saints' Day, on November 1st, to clean and refurbish the cemetery. Like graveyard homecomings in other parts of the South, it is a traditional gathering. It is both a day of work, scraping and whitewashing the tombs, raking leaves, picking up trash, and planting flowers, at a time of community and renewal. People talk and share stories about the past, forming new bonds with those who share that connection to the plantation as part of their family history. The cemetery is set near the end of the road where the houses and the quarters once were. It is a beautiful place of rest, shaded by large pecan trees and surrounded by sugarcane fields. And if you've read A Lesson Before Dying, you can see where Ernest Gaines got the inspiration to write the scene of the old man going through the cemetery. In late October, the sugarcane harvest or grinding is in progress, and pecans from the trees are usually plentiful. These add to the sense of ritual and homecoming as people take breaks from the work to cut a few stalks of sugarcane or pick pecans. The older people remembered the pleasure of chewing sugarcane when they were growing up in Cherie quarters. And I can remember Ernie showing graduate students and younger children, how to cut the cane, how to chew it, cautioning them not to swallow it, and taking a real pleasure in passing this on to the next generations of descendants of Cherie quarters. Okay. They also took the time to introduce the younger family members and visitors to the people that they may not have known. People revisit their memories of the place and the people buried there, while reaffirming their identities as part of this community that has been immortalized in Ernest Gaines' fiction. Ernest Gaines has touched the lives of countless people through his critically acclaimed novels and stories. He has also acknowledged that his imagined literary landscape and the people its people are rooted in the narratives and the people he had known as a child growing up in Cherie quarters. These are the people buried in Mount Zion Cemetery. In a booklet called An Obsession of Mine, Gaines wrote, quote, "This plot of land is where my ancestors have been buried for over 100 years, where most of the people I knew as a child are now buried. My ancestors for over 100 years planted the sugarcane here, cultivated the sugarcane, cut it when it was time, and hauled it to the mill. They, like many others who worked this land, are buried here in the unmarked graves because they could not afford a headstone." In a documentary, Gaines said, "This cemetery is very important to me, to my writing, because without those people, I wouldn't have anything to write about. Wouldn't have anything to write about." As he said many times as well, Ernest Gaines wanted to be buried in this cemetery among the unmarked grave of his ancestors. And on his gravestone, he wanted inscribed, quote, "To lie with those who have no marks." On this Saturday, before the first All Saints' Day since his passing, there can be no gathering in the cemetery because of COVID-19. As we gather virtually, we do know that Ernie would want it so, would want his people to be safe, would want us to remember the former beautification days and to have the courage to hope that next year, on the Saturday before La Toussaint, we will once again come together in Mount Zion Cemetery to remember him and all those in the cemetery who have no marks.
Thank you, Dr. Gaudet. Sorry. Our next speaker, Dr. William Ferris, who is a professor emerita from the University of North Carolina of renowned folklorist and former director of NEH, will now speak. Dr. Ferris.
Thank you, Shalon. I want to echo Keith and all of our distinguished participants in saying how wonderful you've been to set up this one amazing technology. Because of COVID, we still reach out and hold hands through the internet. And what a pleasure to do that in honor of our dear friend, Ernest Gaines. Alice Walker introduced me to the work of Ernest Gaines in 1971 when I taught at Jackson State University. At that time, Alice and her husband, Mel Leventhal, lived in Jackson with their young baby, Rebecca. Alice had recently sent Mr. Gaines her manuscript of The Third Life of Grange Copeland, and he in turn shared his galleys of the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman with her. Alice spoke enthusiastically about Mr. Gaines's literary talent and his generosity in helping younger writers. The following year, I began teaching American and Afro-American studies at Yale University, where I used Mr. Gaines's recently published autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman as a text in my class. I invited him to speak to my students, and to my delight, he accepted. Mr. Gaines read passages from his new novel and spoke about his craft as a writer. His soft, gentle voice animated his characters with special power. In 1980, I interviewed Mr. Gaines at his apartment in San Francisco. Before the interview, he showed me beautiful black and white photographs he had taken at his childhood home of New Roads, Point Coupé Parish, Louisiana. Majestic oak trees, country roads, and the houses of family and friends were lovingly framed and hung in his front hall. Those photographs in his San Francisco apartment clearly connected to his fiction. During the interview, we sat together in Mr. Gaines's study, where a photograph of William Faulkner hung above his desk. He recalled his childhood in Louisiana and the beloved aunt who raised him. We also spoke about Southern storytellers and how their voices shaped his fiction. We visited again in 1992 when we spoke at a symposium on African Americans in Europe held at the Sorbonne in Paris. Wearing his signature beret, Mr. Gaines read from his fiction and was lionized by his French admirers. While at the National Endowment for the Humanities, I attended the ceremony when President Bill Clinton presented both Toni Morrison and Mr. Gaines with the National Humanities Medal in 2000. During the summer of 2010, my wife Marcia and I spent 2 wonderful days with Ernie and Diane Gaines at their beautiful home on False River Road in Oscar, Louisiana. They built their home on land they purchased that was originally part of the plantation where Mr. Gaines's ancestors worked as slaves. The plantation manor stands several hundred yards south of the home on False River Road. During our visit, Marcy and I walked with Diane through sugarcane fields and visited the historic cemetery where Mr. Gaines had restored his ancestral burial site. He also moved to his property and restored the school church where he studied and worshiped as a child. His black and white photographs that hang on the wall of that building reminded me how the memory of his childhood worlds shaped his literary career. In Mr. Gaines's living room, a framed photograph of the aunt who raised him and was later the inspiration for Miss Jane Pittman is prominently displayed. In May 2011, Mr. Gaines received an honorary degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Before the ceremony, Ernie and Diane Gaines had lunch with Marcy and me in our home, along with my former student, Rudolph Byrd, who was writing Mr. Gaines's biography. Each time we met, I was struck by the gentle voice of this great writer who created such loving portraits of his characters. In his fiction, he forges relationships of love between black and white figures in uniquely beautiful ways. Ernest Gaines immeasurably enriched our lives. And in the interview I recorded at his apartment in San Francisco in 1980, he spoke about how he created the character of Miss Jane Pittman. He told me, I was trying to recall what people do in the South. They come together, they talk at events such as funerals or baptisms or weddings or wakes or the birth of a child. They come together and they do a lot of talking. You might have a dozen or more people sitting around talking. Let's listen to him talking now about Miss Jane.
Of course, I don't think I could have done it had I not been born in Louisiana. I mean, if I'd been born in Arkansas, I would probably made her an Arkansas, whatever you call this, people in Arkansas, or Texan, Georgian, or whatever. But I happened to come from Louisiana, and she was gave a little Louisiana terms to use and dialect. And it was, and when I was writing that book, I, after reading all this stuff that I'd read, I had to, as I said, put it into the mind of an illiterate who with basic common sense, but did not have the advantage of books. And during the time I was writing it, I was trying to hear the voices, not of all these ex-slave narratives that I'd read, but also what I knew of the voices of my Louisiana people. And so that's how it came about. I just, and I don't know how it happened that I could. Well, I think that after I got really moving with the voice, with her voice, letting her tell the story, it just followed through. It just I I hate to say things like I hear the voices, because then they think you're nuts, you're going around the street hearing voices and all this sort of thing. But it seemed that when I sat down at the desk, the voice just took over again, and I just started from where I left off from the day before.
Thank you, Dr. Ferris, and thank you for putting together that lovely slideshow. Our next speaker, Dr. John Lowe, who is a professor at the University of Georgia, a Gaines Scholar, and the official biographer for Dr. Ernest J. Gaines, will now tell us his memories and stories of Dr. Ernest J. Gaines.
Thank you, Shay. A few days ago, another hurricane swept through Louisiana, taking down some towering oaks. But a year ago, we lost another monument of Louisiana culture, our beloved Ernest. Fortuitously, however, just days before he passed, he presided yet again at the annual cemetery event he and Diane created, mingling with friends and relatives who came to perform the annual cleaning of the cemetery to place floral tributes. As always, this concluded with a feast under the carport, lovingly prepared by the local ladies. This meal, equally set, has been an apt metaphor for Gaines's literary project, as it constituted what Martin Luther King called the beloved community. I first met Ernest in 1993. One of my colleagues at LSU was the general editor of a series devoted to interviews with notable authors. I asked her if she thought they'd like a book that focused on interviews Gaines had done. She said, of course. Accordingly, I wrote him and asked if I could interview him when he came to campus for a talk, and he replied in the affirmative. I arranged to meet him at LSU's faculty club, and I'll always remember the sight of him coming to greet me down a long hallway on the second floor. He was a commanding figure, sporting a dapper beret and a dashing outfit. I had my recording device with me, and we sat down for an engrossing several hours. Ernest and I hit it off. Over the next decades, we and our wives became close, partly because we had some friends in common at ULL and in the Baton Rouge area, particularly LSU professor, Vice Chancellor Hewell Perkins and his wife Thelma. Another point of connection with Ernie came from my membership in the Louisiana Folklore Society, where I met Marcia Gaudet, and through my friendship with her, I met and enjoyed the company of many of her colleagues at USL, including Darrell Bourque and the legendary Patton Milton Rickles. When June and I started visiting in Oscar, the Gaineses had just built their brand new residence. Over the years, we were introduced to other members of the family, including Diane's 4 children, some of Ernest's siblings, nieces and nephews, and a number of their friends in the community. There were many joyous meals either at Chez Lowe or in Oscar, where we dined on Diane's delicacies, such as her famous New Orleans gumbo, her fried fish, or her fresh fig pie. Ernest often told me how lucky he had been to marry such a great cook. On other occasions, we'd eat out, almost always at the Gaines's favorite place, Morel's, built on the piers over False River. Mikhail Bakhtin said, "No meal is ever sad," and none of these were. Very often while we were waiting for the food to get there, Ernest would tell tales and jokes. He always said he wasn't good at either, and that the real joker in the family was his brother Lionel, but we were often left in stitches when Ernie got going. 9 years ago, I was seated by him in the Gaines's spacious kitchen. June and I had been invited up for a lovely party they gave for the visiting poet laureate of South Africa, who took a seat by me and Ernest. When the laureate was called away, Ernest turned to me and said, "John, I've been meaning to ask you, when are we going to do our book?" At that time, I was in the initial stages of editing a Modern Language Association text that would be called Approaches to Teaching Gaines's The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman and Other Works, which Herman Beavers came on later as the co-editor. And that's what I thought he was referring to. He corrected me. "No, I mean my biography." Floored, I blurted out, "But Ernest, I've never written a biography. And besides, are you going to tell me everything I need to know?" I'll never forget his reply, "But John, you know my work better than anyone." What a compliment, but also what a responsibility. Over the years that have followed, I interviewed him many times, more often than not in his trailer by the river, where he had a stash of wine that we shared, but also in the Gaines's elegant dining room. He gave me a list of people he thought I should interview, including many in California. And I did so. I've interviewed quite a number of people over the past few years, but the ones with Ernie were the most fascinating because I never knew where they might lead. Yes, I had questions ready, but they often set him off on memories they inspired, and we'd go into unexpected territories. Just about everything was fair game. He was quite frank about his carousing days and what he saw as his failures, but he was also immensely proud of his accomplishments and of the role his culture, his friends, and especially his wife and family played in making him the writer he was. Writing this biography has been one of the great honors of my life, eclipsed only by the friendship I shared with him, but it hasn't been an easy task. Many of the people who knew Ernest best had died by the time I started, and many others were far away on the West Coast. Most problematic, however, was the fact that he never had been a big letter writer. There are only a handful of personal letters from him in the Gaines collection. Another issue, his handwriting has a lovely flowing shape, but it's really hard to decipher. A great resource for this project has been the myriad interviews Gaines generously sat for. He loved these occasions clearly, which had a counterpart after his readings when he took questions from the audience. While he was a gripping reader of his work, his repartee with his interrogators was always lively, creative, and filled with humor. He was not only a great thinker and writer. Despite what he said, he was an immensely gifted oral storyteller, and he could always find a great example from his reading, from folklore, from history, the lyrics of a song, to nail down his points. I've also relished the wonderful talks I've had in Louisiana, California, and elsewhere with Diane, his siblings, especially Lois and Norbert, his friends and fellow writers who've been generous in sharing their memories. An African proverb states that no people should be hungry for their own image. Gaines, as a young boy transplanted to California, was for the first time able to check books out of a library, but he didn't find any that spoke to him. Like Toni Morrison, he determined to fill that void and dedicated himself to a literary life, and he stayed true to this despite some years of struggle and privation. Always, though, he was sustained by his large and loving family, many of whom had joined him in California, and by his wide array of friends there, drawn from ordinary working folk, Stanford intellectuals, and literary bohemians. At Stanford, he found a lifelong friend in the great writer Wendell Berry, who ranks Gaines with Faulkner. And I'd like to read from a poem he sent Ernest in the form of a letter. Dear Ernie, I've known you since we were scarcely more than boys, sitting as guests at Wallace Stegner's table, and I have read everything you've written since then because I think what you've written is beautiful and quietly, steadily brave, in the best manner of the best bravery. I feel in a way closer to your work than to that of anybody of our age. Why is that? I think it's because we both knew the talk of old people, old country people in summer evenings. Having worked hard all their lives long and all the long day, they came out on the gallery down in your country, out on the porch or doorstep in mine, where they would sit at ease in the cool of evening, and they would talk quietly of what they had known, of what they knew. In their rest and quiet talk, there was peace that was almost heavenly, peace never to be forgotten, never again quite to be imagined, the peace above all else that we have longed for. Ernie's reverence for inner peace was offset by his vigor. He was a celebrated athlete as a youth and a constant walker around his beloved San Francisco until a fall down a flight of stairs led to back problems, operations, and ultimately limited mobility. Adding to this, in his later life, for a time he fretted about being written out, until he burst through a logjam and finished his most recent publication, The Tragedy of Brady Sims. More often, however, he found satisfaction looking back on what he had achieved and on his present situation. He said, "I have the most beautiful 6 acres on earth. My companions are the water, the willows, the wind. I sit in my office and look at the church or beyond to the trees. These are all things that foster concentration. Now that I'm in my 80s, I look back at all the work I did in my 20s and 30s. I did a hell of a lot." Despite his increasing infirmities, he never lost this drive to push his writings into new challenges. And at his death, he was still working on a new novel that focused on a Creole lady's daughters. While Gaines became a leading literary light for a global readership, he will always be cherished most by the people of his home state, which functions as the breathing, throbbing heart and soul of his novels and stories. As his biographer, the editor of 2 books on his work, and his longtime friend, I can testify that he was simply one of the finest human beings I have ever encountered. His values were deeply held and were congruent with the most cherished tenets of our democracy. He cheerfully offered his services to any number of charities, schools, and organizations, and worked especially hard to help develop Louisiana's libraries. His commitment to literacy for all citizens found expression in his many public lectures, as well as in his impassioned fiction. His central characters echo his own inner integrity in the battles they fight and in their treatment of others. Finally, I've been honored to know him, to have read him, to have presented him to 2 generations of students, and now to introduce his life in some detail in my biography, which I hope will create new apertures into his work and attract new generations. I'm happy to note today that last week I had a meeting with the editor-in-chief of the Library of America, John Kulka, whose board has agreed to publish, pending reproduction rights, 2 Gaines volumes that will cover almost all of his work. Volume 1, Early Novels and Stories, includes Catherine Cormier, Bloodline of Love and Dust, and the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. And the second volume, Later Novels and Stories, will feature In My Father's House, A Gathering of Old Men, A Lesson Before Dying, and The Tragedy of Brady Sims, Stories from Mozart and Leadbelly. The second volume will be published first, ideally in 2 years, in tandem with my biography. The first volume will follow. As most of you know, inclusion in the Library of America signifies the writer belongs in the pantheon of our nation's greatest writers. Appearance there leads to increased sales of existing individual volumes, greater awareness of lesser-known works, and heightened inclusion of the writer's works in various high school and college courses. More emerging writers, like those honored each year by the Gaines Award, will find a model here as well. While we sadly must go on in our lives without the living presence of our beloved friend and example, we can take comfort in the fact that his legacy will continue and prosper as new generations of readers profit from the radiant works he has bestowed, writings that challenge, inspire, and nourish us as we face an uncharted future. The leaves of his books, like those of the live oak that spoke to Jane Pittman, will forever be evergreen in our hearts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lowe. Our final speaker, Dr. Darrell Borg, is a 2-time poet laureate for the state of Louisiana, a professor emerita from the University of Louisiana Lafayette, from the English department where Dr. Gaines also wrote, and a friend and scholar of Ernest J. Gaines. Dr. Borg.
Thank you, Shaylin. I want to follow everybody who commented before on your expertise and your genius in maneuvering and negotiating us through this gathering that we're having this afternoon and early this evening. I would also like to point out what an honor it is to be in a program with people who are so dedicated to the works of this literary giant. Marcia Gaudet, the founder of the Gaines Center, Keith Clark, William Ferris, John Lowe, and Gaines's family and Gaines's loved ones and fans who are with us this afternoon. Gaines and I were both working our way into University of Louisiana faculty in the late 70s and the early 80s. And having been a colleague of Ernest J. Gaines for 20 plus years, there are so many things, so many memories that are precious to me in that association, not the least of which are, being introduced to Ernest's work in a sports bar in Tallahassee when they were showing the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, something that happened after an evening seminar while I was in graduate school. I could talk about the parties on Buena Vista Boulevard in Arbolado, where Ernest lived when he was the writer in residence at the University of Louisiana. I could talk about the parties that we had at his house and my house, the way in which eventually Ernie introduced us to his beloved Diane, and the way in which that association became a friendship of husbands and wives, me and Karen and Ernest and Diane and Diane's children, and also I remember indelibly being introduced to Nicholas and Annalise and Ernie's love of Diane's children, and there are just so many things. But the thing that sticks for me this afternoon is being introduced in the 1980s to Cherie Quarters by Ernest Gaines. Ernest took me and Karen and Rachel and Nicole, our daughters, into Cherie Quarters, and I did all amazing things that happen and mythological proportioned events in our lives. The shaping of the event often falls away, and there is inside of it some kind of beautiful jewel that exists. And so I don't know how we got there. I don't know what the arrangements were. I know that we saw the Jane Pittman Oak and that he took us to the banks of the river. I know that eventually we ended up at Mount Zion Cemetery, and he talked about the importance of the cemetery and the importance of his aunt. And I know that during that visit, we went to the church and the schoolhouse, and he pointed out an old house that was being overgrown and talked about pecans and acorns falling on the tin roofs, and how that works its way into some of the stories. But the jewel in it is the introduction of the last of the old men who were living in the quarters at the time. And in this particular visit, Ernest introduced us to Reese Spooner, and we got to sit on the gallery at Reese's house. And I remember that we ended the visit by sitting on the back steps at Reese's house. Rachel says that she remembers that Reese was a quiet man with blue eyes. I don't remember Reese's eye color at all. But this was a powerful moment. And it was a moment shortly after which Gaines had published A Gathering of Old Men. And Reese Spooner is in every one of those old men. But I'd like to close tonight by turning the words in this remembrance back to Ernest by reading a section from A Gathering of Old Men, where I imagine Reese is speaking through the character of Cyril Robillard. And this is how it goes. "It ain't gonna work this time, Sheriff," Klaatu said from the end of the gallery. Mapes turned his head quick. "Who said that?" he asked. He heard where the voice came from, and he knowed it was Klaatu's voice, but he didn't think Klaatu would own up to it. "I said, who said that?" he asked. "I did, Sheriff." Mapes pretended he couldn't find Klaatu in the crowd. Klaatu was the only person sitting at that end of the gallery, and Mapes pretended he couldn't find him. Then, when he did, he stared at Klaatu long and hard. He thought if he stared at him long enough, Klaatu was bound to look down. But Klaatu didn't look down. He sat there with that shotgun over his legs, looking straight back at Mapes. "What's the matter with you, Klaatu?" Mapes said. "You're the last person I thought would be looking for trouble." "That's been my trouble," Klaatu said. "What?" Mapes said. Mapes was looking at him the way white folks do round here, looking at him hard. "I ain't had no trouble with the law," Klaatu said. "Meaning?" Mapes said. "I'm old," Klaatu said. "Meaning?" Mapes said. About time I had a little trouble with the law before I died." "You really want to go to jail, don't you?" Klaatu Mapes said. "I figured I was on my way when I shot him," Klaatu said. "Amen," Beulah said from the steps. Mapes looked at Klaatu the way white folks know how to look at a nigger when they think he's being smart. "Isn't it a little late for you to be getting militant around here?" Mapes asked Klaatu. "I always been militant," Klaatu said. "My intro's gone sour, keeping my militants down." "Sure now," said Mapes, looking at him hard. "Sure now is right," Klaatu said. "No use talking to Matthew. He didn't do nothing. I did it." And there are resonances and echoes of so many of Gaines' characters, of so many of Gaines' themes in that short passage, that short exchange between Matthew and, between Klaatu and Mapes. But I think what struck me today was that there's also the resonance of a more contemporary giant in human rights, John Lewis, when John Lewis talks to us about good trouble. And good trouble was something that Ernest understood. Good trouble was something that every one of his characters understood. And good trouble is maybe, one of the important parts of the legacy of being human that Ernest J. Gaines leaves with us on this day when we celebrate remembrance, when we celebrate the importance of Mount Zion Cemetery, when we celebrate the importance of Cherie Quarters, when we celebrate the importance of everything that we know that Gaines has taught us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Borg. So at this time, we're gonna open it up for anyone who's in, any of our participants to say something. You can add it to the chat box, and if you look to the left of the chat box, there's a little icon that says grab the mic. You can use that, and you can be projected on screen, and you can talk. I'll start, I guess. So in 2015, I met Dr. Gaines and Mrs. Diane after I started here as the head and archivist of the Ernest J. Gaines Center. And I was incredibly nervous to meet Ernest J. Gaines. I was nervous, so nervous I forgot my notebook and my pencil, and I had a whole panic attack and made my husband stop and so I could buy a notebook and a pencil. And I remember meeting Dr. Gaines, and I remember talking incredibly fast about everything, just because it was so important to me that he could see how important it was to me to be working with someone whose entire career was dedicated to the preservation of his very special community, because that's what I wanted my career to be. My entire life has been shaped by Southern rural Blackness, Southern rural Black masculinity. I was raised by Southern rural Black men, by sharecroppers, and there's a connection. There's a connection there that, in working with him, has always pushed me and motivated me and reminded me that I was doing the work I'm supposed to do. Especially when things got really hard and really exhausting and really overwhelming. Just hearing him say he was proud of the work I was doing when I felt like I wasn't doing enough, and it wasn't good enough, and it wasn't visible enough, and I wasn't pushing hard enough, even though I was giving my all, is something that it's something that has steeled me in my profession. I don't have a lot of pictures. I don't have any pictures with Dr. Gaines. But what I have is a very few words. That's one of the most important things I think I have right now. Because it's not just taking care of his words. Through his words, through his writing, he has preserved the entire history of a community that is long gone. He has actively worked to preserve the way of life and the culture and of a world that people cannot fathom, that has shaped not just South Louisiana, but has shaped this country to its core for generations. He saw a gap, and he filled it. And he filled it in a way that is undeniable and unquestionable. And that is what preservation is. That is what I strive to do. And to have had the opportunity to work with such a great person, someone who went from just being this idea of a man to a fully formed person, more than a friend to me, has been a true blessing. On November 5th, 2019, my heart broke again, the same way it broke my grandfather's past and every other man who has ever been important to me. And the same pain I felt then and sadness was also coupled with the same drive and desire, because I know that they knew what I could do even when I didn't. And because of that, I have to keep going. Sorry. So this event is very special, because this event we got to hear his friends continually express why he was and is and will always be a phenomenal author, and his work, and why his work has shaped not just South Louisiana, but the views of American Southernness for a global community for generations. And to that is something to celebrate. Although he is no longer with us, he will always be with us. Every time you pick up a Gaines novel, every time you read an interview, or you hear an interview, he's there, and he's teaching us stuff every single day. So please share if anyone has anything else they would like to share or talk or just discuss. The floor is open. We have Miss Adelaide Russo states, what a wonderful series of testimonies. Ernest was with us today. Faryal Atif says, such beautiful testimonies by Dr. Gaines' wonderful friends. Thank you for sharing your memories. Roz Arbel affirms all the things that have been said today. Sherry Curry says, you've done so much to take care of his words. Thank you. Does anyone have a favorite story, a favorite novel of Dr. Gaines? My favorite novel is Of Love and Dust, and I am just really baffled by that, why that was not made into a made-for-TV movie, because that novel is amazing and it reads like a Lifetime movie, and I would love to see it, to have seen it on film, or to see it on film. We have a picture to share from Dr. Gaudet. Roz says, "The sky is gray always touched me, even when I was a kid." That is a beautiful novel, yes. This is a picture from one of the cemetery cleanings in Oscar, Louisiana. Dr. Gaudet, could you tell us what year this picture was taken?
Yeah, it was taken in 2014 because it's the year before you came. Okay, and it's taken by photographer Philip Gould. And what I love about it is Ernie and Diane right in the center. I don't know if you can enlarge it and show that. Then right to Ernie's side is Norbert, and many other people who were, always there. His nephew Wilfred on the front row, and you can see others who came every year. It also gives you somewhat of a view of the cemetery. So, but it is one of there are other pictures of the whole group, but it wasn't often that they could get the whole group together. And I think Philip Gould managed. I always associate that with someone who's extremely tall, because they can command people to stay in one place until he could get the picture taken. But I think it's a great photograph of the group at the cemetery that year.
It's a lovely photograph.
Mm-hmm.
Farrell says her favorite book is A Lesson Before Dying. Wanda Kolar says her favorite book is Catherine Cormier. Wanda Kolar is Dr. Gaines' niece. And we're so happy to have you with us today, Wanda. And everyone, we're happy to have everybody with us today. I think one of the favorite quotes I have from Dr. Gaines, and I say it all the times, is words mean nothing. Action, that's the only thing. I have said it so many times to students walking down the halls when they say things about how stressful things are, what they're going to do differently when they can, and it's words mean nothing. Action, that's the only thing. And it's the truth. It's a call to action. We say things all the time, but it's your behavior that tells the truth about you. Linda Alex Wood says, Ernest made me start back making tea cakes. He was so gracious, and I think of him every time I make them now. Yes. Sherry Curry says, Dr. Gaines was such a gentle person too. My husband still remembers how Dr. Gaines helped him change his flat tire in the Albertsons parking lot near UL Lafayette years ago. He was so kind and helpful, as well as being such an outstanding author. Freddie Woods' favorite book is also A Lesson Before Dying. And also, again, if you would like to actually talk, there should be a little icon right next to your chat box. You're more than welcome to click it. It is the grab the mic function, so you can talk, or you can keep putting them in the chat boxes, and I'm more than happy to read them aloud for everyone.
Shayla, can I add something? This is a story from my husband, Irby, and this is at one of the early cemetery days that we went to. And he asked him about did they know where some of the unmarked graves were? And Ernie said, well, we think that where there's, sort of an indentation, that was probably, the site of one of the burials, because then the land would have sunk, a little bit. And so he said, I tried to remember, and do something at those places. And then, his characteristic, wonderful use of sort of the humor of survival. Then he grinned and he said, but we may be remembering and sanctifying tractor ruts. And that was a wonderful characteristic of his, that even at the most, at times that, extremely important to him, he also had that capacity, to look at things and see maybe some humor in them.
Mrs. Diane Gaines says her favorite book is The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. We just had a really great class around the film adaptation of The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman last week. And that's one of the most endearing things about Dr. Gaines's work, is that no matter when people engage it, they always leave with so much more than they came with. Talking with students as they're watching this film adaptation, which was from the 70s, and watching them engage with that landscape and getting an understanding for what was actually kind of happening at that time period to people, and how the systems were in place, and how the systems were, and why the systems were in place, and the whole point of those systems has always been really, really amazing. And seeing a class of 30-something students cheer for Miss Jane, or reading, because we can't be in person, but reading the comments of seeing these students rooting for Ned and cheering for Jane, even though it's the film version, to drink from the water fountain, or being devastated at Jimmy's death, is just show the humanity that Gaines writes into all of his characters is almost unfathomable. Like, all these people. You might not know them personally, but people who have those exact same characteristics. You can just swap the names almost. And it helps you understand the world around you in a different way, because you have the opportunity to evaluate it through it's kind of a detached lens in a good way. We get very personal about things at times, and reading it through fiction, and all of his work is based in historical accuracy, which is one of the other great things about Gaines's work, allows us to learn more about ourselves and our communities, and hopefully take some positive attributes back to make our spaces a better place. Freddie Wood says, it was such an honor to meet and remember sharecropping with someone who had done it as well. It was very eye-opening to find our boyhoods were so similar. Reading Gaines has made me a better reader.
Shaylin, I wanted to say a couple of things. I've been using Gaines's work with community groups, and one of the sections of the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman that really has resonance with a lot of the groups that I work with is Ned's sermon by the river. And you were just mentioning, the historical accuracy and the historical contextualization, of a story that's transferred to 20th century Louisiana. Is just one of the geniuses, of Gaines's work. And the other thing that I wanted to point out is that as we gather today to talk about the importance of Gaines and the importance of Mount Zion Cemetery and so forth, one of the things that we might remember is that will not continue to be preserved as a historical site unless we become involved. And I know that that Mrs. Gaines, along with Ernest, had been active during Ernest's lifetime to make sure that that was a preservation site. And I hope that all of us who are listening today make a commitment, to continue to make sure that remains an important world historical site.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Hopefully next year we can go back and we can continue to work to preserve that space. I know Mrs. Gaines and his family and his nephew, they are working to preserve that space all the time, and they need support in doing so. We have a few more comments. Miss Roz Arbel says, he always supported my creative self. He never put me down for my weirdness, quote unquote. He nurtured my love of music and old films. We had so many good times together. I miss him. And when I read his words, I remember so many things. Thank you so much for your touching words, everyone. It means a lot. Michelle Ladeau says her favorite books are The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman and A Lesson Before Dying. And don't worry about the typos, Roz. It is completely okay. That's as we remember Dr. Gaines, we're also remembering his community, because that's what shaped him. He writes all those people into existence again. And in honoring him, we honor them. I also, like, today's been kind of a rough day because I enjoyed going to the cemetery clean. We were up really early. We were there all day, but the fellowship was always amazing, always great. We always got to meet new people, and more and more students started coming. Last year, we had a caravan of like 12 or 14 cars, and just seeing all those people there wanting to share that experience. And we can still do that. We can still do that. You can do that by encouraging people to read Gaines, obviously. Like, we have a book club through the Gaines Center. That's not just focused only on Gaines' works, but Southern literature specifically. So you can follow us on our social media platforms, which is Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also join our email list. I have added those links up further in the chat box. And we can participate that way. You're more than welcome to email us here at the Ernest J. Gaines Center. Just, share your thoughts, ideas, questions about books, or even access to materials in the archive. I just realized I didn't go through my spiel about the Gaines Center, so I'm gonna do that now. The Ernest J. Gaines Center is an international research center focused on the work and legacy of Dr. Ernest J. Gaines. Within our center, we have 3 collections. We have an archival collection, a reference collection, and a circulating collection, which means students, faculty, and community members with the university library card can check out those books. Through the center, we do public programs such as this one. We do research assistance, class tours and visits, and discussion groups. We thank everybody for their continual support of the Ernest J. Gaines Center, and we hope for your continued support of the Ernest J. Gaines Center. And again, we thank everybody for attending and participating today. We have about 10 more minutes. So, my husband would like to say something.
Hello, I am Larry Moore, Shaylin's husband. I just wanted to say Mr. and Mrs. Gaines have been like family, treated us like family. They have been so supportive of us inside and outside of the center, as well as even though I disappointed him about not watching sports, we still found things to talk about. And I just wanted to let Ms. Gaines know that I appreciate her and him and them together. I forgot what else I wanted to say. Thank you.
Sambra Kolar asks if this video will be available to be shared at a later date. Absolutely. Through the Ernest J. Gaines Center, one of the great things we started doing actually this year is an open resource page. And on the open resource page, these are where people who don't have access to the data, like many of our international researchers, can still have access to research on Dr. Gaines to write their papers. And under that page, we have started a video library, where all of our recorded public programs will be located. If you are once we have the link together, and I'm going to drop the link for the open resource page in the chat box. Once we have the video is edited and available, it will also be located on our website, on our social media platforms, and this memorial will go out in the Gaines newsletter the next time we have an e-newsletter. Well, if there are no other comments, I again would like to thank everybody for coming, and again, follow us on social media. And we look forward to to engaging with you, because I want to say sing and I can't say that, but engaging with you all at some of our other events. Miss Wanda Kolar says, thank you for the inspiring tribute to Uncle Ernie. Your uncle was inspiring to so many people the globe over. It's only fitting and it's only right to do something and to celebrate his life. Linda Alex, thank you all for coming again. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at the Ernest J. Gaines Center. My email address is cheylon.woods, WOODS, @louisiana.edu. My contact information can also be found under the staff page of the Ernest J. Gaines Center's website. And like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you guys so much. You all have a wonderful rest of your Saturday, and happy Halloween, and have a great rest of your weekend. Thank you.